October 3, 1986, 680 miles northeast of Bermuda, North Atlantic Ocean. Seaman Sergei Preminin descended the ladder into the reactor compartment for the third time that night. Even though he knew he probably wouldn't come back up, the 20-year-old sailor could feel the temperature rising with each step. The metal rungs were already uncomfortably warm against his palms. Above him, through the hatch, he could hear Captain Second-Rank Igor Britanov's voice, tight with controlled panic, coordinating the evacuation of K-219. Below him, in the bowels of the Yankee-Class ballistic missile submarine, 2 nuclear reactors threatened to melt down 18,000 feet above the Atlantic floor. The explosion had come without warning 3 hours earlier, a roar that shook the entire 426-foot submarine, followed by the acrid smell of burning metal and oxidizing rocket fuel. Missile Tube 6 had erupted in flames, killing 3 sailors instantly and filling the compartments with toxic nitrogen dioxide gas that turned men's faces blue as they suffocated. Now, with seawater flooding into the missile compartment and 16 SSN-6 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles still aboard, K-219 was dying. But the reactors, those were the real problem. If they went critical, the explosion would contaminate hundreds of square miles of ocean, possibly trigger an international incident, maybe even a war. Preminin knew what he had to do. Someone had to manually lower the control rods to shut down reactor number 2. The radiation levels in the compartment were already lethal. The automatic systems had failed. He was the only one left who knew the procedure and could still move. As he reached the bottom of the ladder and felt the heat wash over him like opening an oven door, Sergei Preminin thought about his mother in Leningrad and wondered if they would ever tell her the truth about what happened to her son. They wouldn't. For decades, the Soviet Union would claim K-219 suffered only a minor technical malfunction. But this was no malfunction. This was the moment the Cold War's underwater nuclear standoff nearly became a catastrophe that could have changed history. In the fall of 1986, the Cold War's underwater dimension had reached a level of dangerous sophistication that both terrified and reassured the strategic planners in Moscow and Washington. The oceans had become the ultimate hiding place for nuclear weapons, submarines carrying enough megatonnage to destroy civilization, prowling silently in waters so deep that finding them was like searching for a whisper in a hurricane. The Soviet Northern Fleet's ballistic missile submarines represented the Kremlin's insurance policy. Unlike land-based missiles that American satellites could track or bombers that radar could detect, the submarines could strike from anywhere, at any time. The submarine force is the sword and shield of the Soviet Union, Admiral of the fleet Sergei Gorshkov had declared in 1984. Invisible, invulnerable, and unstoppable. That confidence permeated every level of Soviet naval command. K-219 was part of that sword and shield, a Project 6, a Yankee-Class submarine, NATO designation Yankee-I, commissioned in 1971. She carried 16 R-27 ballistic missiles, each with a 650-kiloton nuclear warhead. For perspective, that's 35 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The submarine's mission was simple: patrol the western Atlantic, staying within range of American cities, and maintain the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction that kept the superpowers from actually using their arsenals. We considered every patrol a combat mission, recalled Captain First Rank Viktor Voronkov, who commanded a similar Yankee-Class submarine during this period. We were always at war, even in peacetime. The Americans hunted us, we hunted them. The only difference from actual war was that nobody fired. By 1986, K-219 had completed 17 patrols and was showing her age. Soviet submarine construction prioritized quantity over quality. Build them fast, build them cheap, deploy them in numbers that would overwhelm American defenses. The Yankee-Class boats, designed in the 1960s, were already considered obsolete by Western standards. But the Soviet Navy kept them operational because they couldn't afford to retire them. Naval intelligence estimated that 30% of the Soviet ballistic missile submarine fleet had significant mechanical problems. But the political imperative to maintain nuclear parity with the United States meant these aging boats kept going to sea. American naval intelligence knew about K-219 specifically. Attack submarines had been tracking her for years, recording her acoustic signature, photographing her through periscopes, mapping her patrol patterns. We probably knew more about some Soviet submarines than their own crews did, a former U.S. Navy intelligence officer later admitted. We could identify individual boats by the sound of their propellers. What neither side fully appreciated was how dangerous this underwater game of cat and mouse had become. The technology was pushed to its limits. The crews were exhausted from extended patrols. The equipment was aging. And the safety margins, the buffer between normal operations and catastrophic failure, had grown razor thin. In Moscow, the Strategic Rocket Forces Command viewed the submarine patrols as routine. K-219's October deployment was just another box to check, another patrol to maintain the appearance of strategic parity, while Mikhail Gorbachev pursued glasnost and perestroika. The submarine's history of minor mechanical problems wasn't considered unusual. Every boat had problems. In Washington, the Reagan administration was in its final years of the massive military buildup that had defined the decade. The maritime strategy called for aggressive forward operations against Soviet submarines, trailing them close enough to strike immediately if war began. It was provocative, dangerous, and entirely intentional. We wanted them to know we could find them and kill them whenever we wanted, explained John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy under Reagan. That was the deterrent. Neither capital understood that K-219 was a disaster waiting to happen. The missile tubes had been leaking for months. The crew had reported problems with the seals. Maintenance had been deferred. And on October 3, 1986, 680 miles northeast of Bermuda, all those deferred problems came due at once. The Yankee-Class submarines emerged from the Soviet Union's urgent need to match American submarine-launched ballistic missile capabilities in the late 1960s. When the United States deployed the Polaris system, nuclear missiles fired from submarines that could strike Moscow from the safety of the deep ocean, Soviet leadership panicked. Premier Nikita Khrushchev had bet heavily on land-based missiles and strategic bombers, but submarines represented a paradigm shift. They couldn't be targeted preemptively. They were the ultimate second strike weapon. The SKB-385 Design Bureau, led by Chief Designer Viktor Mikhaev, rushed to develop the R-27 submarine-launched ballistic missile and a submarine platform to carry it. The result was Project 667A, authorized in 1962 and first launched in 1967. The design philosophy was typically Soviet: simple, rugged, and buildable in large numbers by shipyards that weren't sophisticated enough to match American construction quality. Between 1967 and 1974, Soviet shipyards launched 34 Yankee-Class submarines. They displaced 9,300 tons submerged, measured 426 feet long, and could theoretically dive to 1,300 feet. Each carried 16 R-27 missiles in vertical launch tubes arranged in 2 rows behind the sail. The crews numbered 120 officers and sailors, crammed into a hull that prioritized weapons over habitability. K-219 was laid down at the Severodvinsk shipyard in northern Russia in 1970 and commissioned on December 31, 1971. Her first commander was Captain Second-Rank Nikolai Shumkov, who described his new command as powerful but temperamental, like a thoroughbred horse that needs constant attention. That temperament showed itself early. In 1973, during K-219's third patrol, A missile tube seal failed, allowing seawater to leak into tube 14. The mixture of seawater and missile fuel created a toxic chemical reaction that nearly killed the crew. Only quick action by the damage control team prevented catastrophe. The submarine returned to base for repairs that took 8 months. The incident should have been a warning. The R-27 missiles used unsymmetric dimethylhydrazine, UDMH, as fuel and nitrogen tetroxide as oxidizer, both hypergolic propellants that ignite on contact with each other. This made them reliable, but also incredibly dangerous. The slightest leak could cause an explosion. The slightest contamination could create deadly toxic gases. And the seals on the missile tubes, designed to withstand seawater pressure at depth, were a known weak point. We lived with these missiles every day, and they terrified us, recalled a former Soviet submarine weapons officer who served on a sister ship to K-219. American missiles used solid fuel, much safer. Ours used liquid fuel because it was cheaper and more powerful. But it meant we were sailing with essentially 16 bombs that could explode if anything went wrong. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, K-219 completed regular patrols, typically spending 70 to 90 days at sea, lurking in patrol boxes off the American East Coast. The crew became intimately familiar with every quirk of their submarine. They learned which valves leaked, which systems needed constant monitoring, which equipment was reliable and which wasn't. By 1986, K-219 was 15 years old, ancient by submarine standards. Western navies typically retired submarines after 20 to 25 years, but the Soviet Navy couldn't afford that luxury. The submarines kept sailing until they literally fell apart. Maintenance was irregular, spare parts were scarce, and the crews made do with improvisation and determination. Captain Second Rank Igor Britanov took command of K-219 in 1985. At 40, he was an experienced submarine officer with a reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail. He inherited a boat that needed extensive repairs but was scheduled for another patrol before the shipyard could address its problems. The missile tube seals were particularly concerning. They had been leaking intermittently for months, and Britanov had filed multiple reports requesting priority maintenance. The problem with our system was that everything was decided by committee and politics, a former Northern Fleet staff officer explained. A captain could report serious problems, but if Fleet headquarters needed that submarine for patrol duty to meet their quota, the problems got downgraded. Minor issues could be deferred. Critical issues required paperwork and explanations. So captains learned to live with minor issues that were actually very serious. As K-219 prepared for her October 1986 patrol, Britanov conducted extra drills. He knew his boat was struggling. He knew the crew was tired. Many were on their second or third patrol without adequate shore leave. He knew the Americans would be waiting for them, trailing them, listening to every sound they made. And he knew that if anything went wrong 300 miles from the nearest help, he would be on his own. On September 24, 1986, K-219 departed the Gadzhievo submarine base on the Kola Peninsula and headed into the North Atlantic. Her mission, Patrol Station 77, an area 680 miles northeast of Bermuda, within range of targets along the American East Coast. The patrol was scheduled to last 90 days. She would be home by Christmas. She never made it back. October 3, 1986, 5:14 a.m. Moscow time. The first indication of disaster was a sound like thunder rolling through the hull. A deep, resonant boom that every sailor aboard K-219 felt in their bones. In the central command post, Captain Britanov grabbed a handhold as the deck pitched violently. Warning lights exploded across the control panels. Then the alarms began screaming. "Explosion in compartment 4!" the damage control officer shouted, Fire in Missile Tube 6. Britanov's mind raced through the implications in seconds. Compartment 4 housed the missile tubes. An explosion there meant a missile had failed. Fire meant the fuel was burning. And if the fuel was burning in a sealed tube, it would generate enormous pressure that could... Missile compartment pressure rising. Another voice called out. Tube 6 hatch buckling. Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Belikov, the weapons officer, didn't wait for orders. He sprinted aft toward compartment 4, knowing that every second counted. Behind him, Seaman Alexander Petrachkov and sailor Nikolai Smagliuk followed, pulling on emergency breathing apparatus as they ran. What they found was hell. Missile Tube 6's upper hatch had blown open, and orange-brown nitrogen dioxide gas was pouring into the compartment like smoke from a chimney. The gas was heavier than air, sinking to the deck, filling the space with toxic fog. The three men could see flames deep in the tube. The missile's fuel was burning, reacting with seawater that had somehow gotten into the tube. Petrachkov and Smagliuk tried to close the tube's isolation valves, but the heat had warped the metal. As they struggled with the mechanisms, nitrogen dioxide filled their lungs. Both men collapsed within minutes, their faces turning blue-gray as their respiratory systems shut down. Belikov dragged them toward the hatch, but he was breathing the gas too. All three died within 20 minutes of the initial explosion. In the control room, Britanov faced cascading failures. The explosion had ruptured pipes, knocked out electrical systems, and cracked the pressure hull in multiple places. Seawater was flooding into compartment 4 at an alarming rate. Worse, the submarine was at patrol depth, nearly 400 feet down, and the damage was affecting buoyancy control. Emergency surface, Britanov ordered. Blow all ballast tanks. As K-219 began her emergency ascent, Britanov got the damage reports that confirmed his worst fears. 3 men were dead. Compartment 4 was flooding, and the 2 nuclear reactors, cooled by seawater systems that drew from compartment 4, were showing temperature spikes. Reactors scrammed automatically, the engineering officer reported. That was good news. The control rods had dropped into the reactor cores, stopping the nuclear reactions. But the residual heat needed constant cooling. Without proper seawater flow, the reactor cores would overheat. And if they overheated enough, they could melt through the containment vessels. K-219 broke surface at 5:47 a.m., 33 minutes after the explosion. The Atlantic dawn was gray and cold. Britanov ordered the hatch opened and climbed to the bridge. Behind him, black smoke poured from ventilation openings. The submarine was listing to starboard, stern down, clearly struggling to stay afloat. In Washington, the first alert came from a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft that detected K-219's emergency surface. Within hours, the frigate USS Carr was steaming toward the distressed submarine. Satellite imagery showed smoke and severe listing. American intelligence officers quickly realized they were watching a Soviet ballistic missile submarine in serious trouble, with 16 nuclear warheads aboard and 2 nuclear reactors potentially failing. This was one of those moments where the Cold War could have gone hot very quickly, recalled Admiral William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We had to balance humanitarian concerns with intelligence gathering with political messaging. We offered assistance, but we also wanted to know what the hell happened to that submarine. Back aboard K-219, Britanov assembled his officers for a brutally honest assessment. The submarine was dying. Compartment 4 was completely flooded. The pressure hull was compromised. And most critically, reactor number 2's cooling system had failed. The reactor temperature was climbing toward dangerous levels. We need to manually scram reactor 2, the engineering officer explained. The control rods dropped, but they're not fully inserted. Someone has to go into the reactor compartment and crank them down manually. Everyone in that compartment understood what that meant. The reactor compartment was flooded with radiation. The person who went in would receive a lethal dose within minutes. They would accomplish the mission and then die, probably within hours or days. Senior Seaman Sergei Preminin volunteered immediately. He was 20 years old, from Leningrad, serving his mandatory military service. He had worked on the reactor systems during training and knew the manual procedures. "I can do it, Captain," he said quietly. Preminin descended into the reactor compartment at 9:25 a.m., accompanied by Seaman Sergei Kovalenko. The heat was overwhelming, over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the radiation meters were pegged at their maximum readings. Together, the two men cranked the control rod mechanisms, forcing the rods deeper into the reactor core. The temperature began to drop, but the manual cranks were difficult to turn, and each rotation took enormous physical effort. After 20 minutes, both men were exhausted, nauseated from radiation sickness, and struggling to breathe in the superheated air. They completed the task. Reactor 2 was safely shut down and began climbing back to safety. Kovalenko went first. Preminin followed, but as Preminin reached the hatch between compartments, someone, either accidentally or following procedure, accounts differ, sealed the hatch behind Kovalenko, trapping Preminin in the reactor compartment. "Open the hatch!" Kovalenko screamed. "Preminin is still inside." They tried. The hatch was jammed, warped by heat, swollen from moisture, or possibly damaged by the earlier explosion. Preminin was on the other side, trying to force it open from his side. For 40 minutes, sailors on both sides of that hatch fought to open it. They could hear Preminin pounding on the metal, his strikes growing weaker as radiation and heat exhausted him. Then the pounding stopped. Sergei Preminin died alone in the reactor compartment of K-219, having saved his submarine and possibly prevented a nuclear catastrophe, but unable to escape the consequences of his heroism. On the surface, Britanov faced more impossible decisions. The USS Carr had arrived and was offering assistance. Moscow was ordering him to refuse all American help and wait for Soviet rescue ships that were still days away. The submarine was sinking by the stern, listing further with each hour, and his crew was exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly desperate. For 3 days, K-219 wallowed in the Atlantic swells, while Britanov's crew fought to keep her afloat. They pumped water, they sealed hatches, they redistributed weight, and they watched the stern settle deeper and deeper into the ocean. On October 6th, Britanov made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered abandoned ship. The crew transferred to a Soviet merchant ship, the Krasnogvardeysk, that had arrived to assist. Britanov remained aboard K-219 with a skeleton crew, still hoping to save his submarine. But on October 6th, at 11:03 a.m., K-219's stern slipped beneath the waves. The bow rose vertically, pointing at the sky like an accusing finger, and then the entire submarine slid beneath the Atlantic surface. She sank 18,000 feet to the ocean floor, carrying Sergei Preminin's body, 16 nuclear warheads, and 2 nuclear reactors to a watery grave 3 miles down. American response. Intelligence bonanza and strategic implications. The loss of K-219 triggered an immediate and sophisticated American intelligence response that revealed just how closely the superpowers monitored each other's underwater assets. Within hours of K-219's sinking, the U.S. Navy had deployed deep ocean surveillance assets to locate and photograph the wreck. The USS Powhatan, a submarine rescue ship equipped with deep-sea submersibles, was diverted to the area. Over the following months, the Naval Underwater Systems Center conducted multiple expeditions to document K-219's final resting place. The resulting intelligence was extraordinary. We could examine every detail of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine without them being able to stop us, a former Navy intelligence officer explained. The design of the missile tubes, the reactor compartment layout, the hull construction, everything we photographed went straight to our submarine designers. The Pentagon drew several operational conclusions from K-219's loss. First, the incident proved that Soviet liquid-fueled submarine-launched missiles were inherently dangerous. American Trident missiles use solid fuel specifically to avoid this type of catastrophic failure. The Navy's confidence in its technological superiority increased measurably. Second, the incident demonstrated Soviet damage control capabilities and their limitations. K-219's crew had fought heroically to save their submarine, but the lack of proper safety systems, inadequate training in catastrophic failures, and poor equipment design had ultimately doomed them. If that had been an American boat, we would have saved her, one U.S. submarine officer commented. Whether true or not, this belief reinforced the Navy's conviction that American submarine operations were fundamentally safer. Third, the Soviet reluctance to accept American rescue assistance revealed the depth of mutual suspicion that still characterized superpower relations, even as Gorbachev pursued glasnost. They'd rather let their submarine sink than let us get close enough to examine it, noted Admiral Crowe. That told us they still viewed us as enemies first, potential rescuers second. American submarine operations actually became more aggressive after K-219. The maritime strategy's emphasis on forward operations intensified, with attack submarines trailing Soviet ballistic missile submarines even more closely. We wanted them to know we were there, watching, ready, explained a former Los Angeles-class submarine commander. The psychological pressure was part of the deterrent. Soviet adaptation, cover-up, recrimination, and reform. In Moscow, K-219's loss triggered a very different response, one characterized by denial, blame-shifting, and eventual grudging reform. Initially, the Soviet Navy and political leadership tried to minimize the incident entirely. TASS, the official Soviet news agency, issued a brief statement on October 4th claiming a Soviet submarine had experienced minor technical difficulties, but that the crew was safe and the situation was under control. No mention of the explosion, the deaths, or the sinking. "We were ordered to say nothing," recalled a former Northern Fleet staff officer. Families of the dead sailors were told their sons died in training accidents. The crew was dispersed to different units and ordered not to discuss what happened. Captain Britanov was relieved of command and placed under investigation. The investigation that followed was brutal and revealing. The Navy's leadership, deeply embarrassed by the loss of a strategic asset, needed scapegoats. Britanov was blamed for improper damage control, for not saving the submarine, for accepting proximity to American ships. The fact that he had saved his crew and prevented a nuclear catastrophe counted for nothing against the political embarrassment of losing a ballistic missile submarine. They wanted to court-martial him, explained Valery Pshenichny, a Soviet naval engineer who later emigrated. The charges were absurd: sabotage, cowardice, incompetence. In reality, he was a hero. But admitting that would have meant admitting the submarine was poorly designed and maintained, and nobody in the system could afford that truth. Britanov was eventually cleared of criminal charges, but forced to resign from the Navy in disgrace. He spent years fighting to clear his name and secure recognition for his crew, particularly Sergei Preminin. It wasn't until after the Soviet Union's collapse that Preminin was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star for his sacrifice. Behind the scenes, however, K-219's loss forced the Soviet Navy to confront uncomfortable realities about its submarine fleet. Classified internal reports acknowledged that the Yankee-Class submarines were dangerous and unreliable. The liquid-fueled R-27 missiles were identified as a critical vulnerability, and the maintenance and safety standards were deemed inadequate. These admissions led to concrete changes. The remaining Yankee-Class submarines underwent emergency inspections. Several were immediately retired. The liquid-fueled missiles were gradually replaced with safer solid fuel designs in newer submarine classes. Training protocols for catastrophic emergencies were completely rewritten, incorporating lessons from K-219's final battle. K-219 was our Challenger disaster, explained a former Soviet submarine designer. It forced us to admit that we had been cutting corners for years, that we had been sending men to sea in submarines that weren't safe enough. The problem was that we couldn't afford to fix everything that needed fixing. The Soviet economy was already collapsing, so we fixed what we could and retired the rest. International reverberations. The underwater arms race reassessed K-219's loss coincided with a broader reevaluation of the underwater nuclear competition. By 1986, both superpowers maintained hundreds of nuclear warheads at sea, aboard submarines that prowled the oceans in a constant state of near war. The cost was astronomical. The risks were enormous. And increasingly, both sides were questioning whether it made strategic sense. The incident occurred just 1 month before Reagan and Gorbachev's Reykjavik summit, where the two leaders came tantalizingly close to agreeing to eliminate all nuclear weapons. While K-219 wasn't directly discussed at Reykjavik, the submarine's loss hung over the proceedings, a reminder of how dangerous the Cold War's military competition had become. "We were one malfunction away from disaster at all times," recalled Admiral Crowe. K-219 proved that. And while it happened to the Soviets this time, it could just as easily happen to us. That reality focused minds on both sides. In Western Europe, news of K-219's sinking, when the full story eventually emerged, reinforced anti-nuclear movements. The campaign for nuclear disarmament pointed to the incident as proof that nuclear weapons endangered everyone, even in peacetime. "These submarines are accidents waiting to happen," declared Bruce Kent, CND's General Secretary. K-219 sank in the middle of the ocean. What if it had been closer to shore? What if the reactors had melted down near populated areas? The ecological concerns were genuine. K-219 rests on the ocean floor with 2 nuclear reactors and 16 nuclear warheads still aboard. Marine scientists have monitored the site for decades, concerned about radioactive contamination. So far, the wreck appears stable, but it remains a source of potential environmental danger, a Cold War legacy that will persist for centuries. The incident also affected how the superpowers approached submarine rescue cooperation. After K-219, both the United States and Soviet Union quietly agreed to better coordination in submarine disaster scenarios. The agreements were informal and classified, but they represented an acknowledgement that some things transcended even Cold War rivalry. "If we knew a Soviet submarine was in trouble, we'd help," explained a U.S. Navy admiral. "And they'd help us, because nobody wanted to see 100 sailors die if it could be prevented." The climax of K-219's story wasn't the explosion or the sinking. It was that 40-minute period when Sergei Preminin pounded on a jammed hatch, while sailors on the other side desperately tried to save him. Seaman Andrei Petrov was one of those sailors. Years later, in a rare interview, he described hearing Preminin's strikes growing weaker. "We knew he was dying. We could hear it in how the pounding slowed down, became irregular, then stopped. And we couldn't do anything. That hatch weighed hundreds of kilograms, warped from heat, and we didn't have the tools to cut through it. We failed him." That moment encapsulated everything about the Cold War's human cost. Preminin wasn't killed by enemy action. He wasn't the victim of espionage or combat. He died because of poor design, deferred maintenance, budget constraints, and the Soviet system's prioritization of political appearances over sailor safety. He died a hero, saving his submarine and shipmates, but he died unnecessarily, a casualty of a competition that valued weapons over the people who operated them. The immediate tactical outcome of K2-19's loss was significant, but not strategically decisive. The Soviet Navy lost 1 ballistic missile submarine and 16 nuclear warheads, a meaningful reduction in capability, but not enough to shift the nuclear balance. The Americans gained valuable intelligence about Soviet submarine design and operational procedures. And the crew of K2-19, scattered and silenced, carried the trauma of their experience for decades. When Captain Britanov finally told his full story in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, the revelations shocked even those familiar with Cold War submarine operations. He described a system where safety was secondary to operational requirements, where maintenance was chronically underfunded, where sailors went to sea knowing their equipment was unreliable, but trusting they could handle any emergency. "We were good sailors," Britanov explained. "We could handle most problems. But we were in submarines that were fundamentally unsafe, with weapons that were dangerous even in peacetime. And when everything went wrong at once, our courage and skill weren't enough. That was the tragedy. Not that we failed, but that we were set up to fail." The public revelation about K2-19 came gradually. In 1988, Soviet journalists began writing about a submarine accident in vague terms. In 1990, Britanov gave his first interview. By 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the full story emerged. The explosion, the deaths, Preminin's sacrifice, the cover-up. Russian President Boris Yeltsin posthumously awarded Preminin the Hero of Russia Medal in 1997, 11 years after his death. The award citation read, "For courage and heroism displayed in preventing a nuclear catastrophe." Britanov attended the ceremony and met Preminin's mother for the first time. "She asked me if her son suffered," Britanov recalled. "I lied and told her he died quickly. What else could I say?" The ultimate impact of K2-19 extended far beyond the individuals involved. The submarine's loss contributed to the accelerating obsolescence of the Yankee-Class boats. By 1994, all Yankee-Class submarines had been retired from service. The liquid-fueled R-27 missiles were phased out entirely, replaced by safer solid-fuel designs. Soviet submarine safety protocols were completely rewritten. More broadly, K2-19 represented a turning point in how both superpowers thought about their underwater nuclear arsenals. The incident demonstrated that the technical complexity of ballistic missile submarines created catastrophic risks that persisted even in peacetime. The cost-benefit analysis of maintaining hundreds of nuclear warheads at sea in aging submarines operated by exhausted crews began to shift. K2-19 was one of many factors that convinced both sides that we needed arms control, explained Ambassador Max Kampelman, who participated in nuclear arms negotiations. "Every incident like this reminded us that the weapons were dangerous to us, not just the enemy." That realization eventually led to START and the dramatic reductions in nuclear arsenals. K2-19 rests today on the Atlantic floor at 18,000 feet, a steel tomb containing Sergei Preminin's body and enough nuclear material to contaminate vast stretches of ocean. Periodic monitoring by both Russian and American researchers suggests the wreck is stable, but it will remain a potential hazard for thousands of years, longer than human civilization has existed. The submarine's loss influenced the trajectory of the Cold War's final years in subtle but meaningful ways. It contributed to the growing realization that the superpower competition had become unsustainably expensive and dangerous. It provided ammunition to reformers in both countries who argued for arms control and reduced tensions. And it demonstrated that technology, no matter how sophisticated, couldn't eliminate the human costs and environmental risks of nuclear weapons. For the Cold War itself, K2-19 illustrated a fundamental paradox. Weapons designed to prevent war created peacetime casualties through accidents, miscalculations, and technical failures. The nuclear submarines that both sides relied on for deterrence were also sources of danger, to their own crews, to the environment, to regional stability. The lessons from K2-19 remain relevant to contemporary great power competition. Modern nuclear submarines are safer and more reliable than their 1980s predecessors, but they still represent the same basic trade-off: invisibility and second strike capability balanced against technical complexity and operational risks. China, Russia, and the United States continue to invest heavily in submarine-launched nuclear weapons, accepting the inherent dangers because the strategic benefits seem to justify them. Captain Igor Britanov died in 2006, still fighting for recognition of his crew's courage and sacrifice. At his funeral, former shipmates from K2-19 gathered to honor the man who had saved their lives but been punished for losing his submarine. They understood what the Soviet system never acknowledged. Britanov had faced impossible choices and made the right ones, prioritizing human life over political embarrassment. Sergei Preminin's sacrifice, descending into lethal radiation to prevent a nuclear catastrophe, represents the Cold War at its most human and most tragic. A 20-year-old conscript who saved hundreds of lives through courage and duty, then died alone because a hatch jammed. His heroism prevented what could have been a disaster orders of magnitude worse. His death resulted from a system that valued secrecy over safety, weapons over people, and political image over honest accounting of risks. The K2-19 disaster reveals the Cold War as it actually was. Not a clash of ideologies in the abstract, but a competition conducted by human beings using dangerously complex technology under enormous psychological pressure. The submarine didn't sink because of Soviet inferiority or American superiority. It sank because maintaining hundreds of nuclear weapons at sea, aboard aging platforms operated by tired crews, is inherently dangerous, regardless of ideology. 3 miles down in the dark Atlantic, K2-19 endures as a monument to the costs of the Cold War. Not the costs counted in rubles or dollars, but the costs measured in lives cut short, families destroyed, and heroes dying alone in the dark, doing their duty even when their systems failed them. When Sergei Preminin descended that ladder for the last time on October 3, 1986, he was just a kid from Leningrad trying to save his shipmates. He succeeded, and in that success, paid for with his life, lies the essential truth about the Cold War. It was fought by ordinary people asked to manage extraordinary dangers, and when they succeeded, as Preminin did, their victories prevented catastrophes the world never knew were possible. That's his legacy. That's K2-19's legacy. And that's why, even now, nearly 4 decades later, we still remember a submarine that sank in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, taking its secrets and its heroes down into the eternal darkness of the deep.